Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome to Who Knew. Today, resident Bob Kluel will be interviewing resident Bill Blake. A distinguished theologian, historian, pastor, and teacher, Bill Blake is truly Westminster Canterbury's Renaissance man. Whether lecturing about medieval history, leading a hymn sing, or beating everyone at croquet, Bill infects us all with positive attitude, his willingness to get involved, and his imperative to finish the work begun. His enthusiasm and drive carry us all along to better places and better things. I hope that you're as excited as I am to learn about Bill's life journey from hardscrabble youth to distinguished professor. We are airing today's program live on TV 970, but we have our live audience too, and we'll be happy to take questions from you after the interview. So now, let's get to the main event.
Thank you, Whitney. Welcome everybody to the November 2021 edition of Who Knew. We do have with us Dr. Bill Blake, described aptly by Whitney as distinguished historian, distinguished theologian, distinguished pastor, and teacher. He holds 6 degrees in history and theology. For nearly 30 years, he's held 2 full-time jobs simultaneously, university professor and pastor. He preaches and teaches from memory without notes. He is equally loved by his students and his congregations for the same reason. The quality of his teaching, yes, and his accessibility. He's a patient listener, a wise counselor, and a good friend. We are blessed to have him among us here at Westminster Canterbury. Whether he is lecturing us about medieval history or holding us to a hymn sing in the chapel, Bill infects us all with his attitude, his willingness to get involved, and his imperative to see things through to the end. Today we'll follow Bill's life journey from hardscrabble youth in northeastern Richmond during the Depression to his rise to distinguished professor and pastor. So welcome, Bill.
Thank you. Thank you, Bob. Thank you. Thank you very much.
You grew up in northeast Richmond in the 1930s. Describe your neighborhood for us.
If you take segregation out of the mixture, growing up in Richmond 1930s in the Fairmount area was like being in the Garden of Eden with no snakes. It was delightful. Happy-go-lucky. My father was a draftsman for Virginia Electric Power Company. My mother was a rapper. That's W-R-A-P-P at Tolhammer's department store. I had a sister who was 2 years older than I, and my great uncle lived with us from earliest time. And so that was my household, and we were sort of like the dead-end kids, and if they'll show us a picture of one of the events in my early life. I was 11 years old when the government declared that we weren't going to be able to buy gas on Sundays. And so my friends and I got together and we got us an old orange crate and some baby buggy wheels and some lumber and put together that cart. And there we are pushing it down the street. How the news leader happened to come along and take a photo of it, and it appeared in the paper then, and then it appeared in the paper again in the 70s when we were facing an oil crisis. So it was a happy time for me growing up. And this is the little fellow looks like a little girl sitting on my lap is George Evans. We called him Peachy, and he became vice president of Federal Reserve Bank.
But who's in the driver's seat?
Yeah, well, I just happened to be there. Yeah.
What role did music and sports play in your early life?
Absolutely vital. I had music from the very beginning. My mother used to sing songs to me. We had an inner player piano. We used to put rolls in, and I used to hear all kinds of music, popular, classical, and became very acquainted with music then. And then I started singing. I just would go from door to door and go up on people's porches in the summer when they're all out sitting, and I'd sing, "Where have you been, Billy Boy?" And Froggy went a courting, and he did rise. And I don't know. How come I did that? I don't know. I just enjoyed doing it. When I was in the 4th grade, I had a teacher named Miss McDowell, and Miss McDowell loved Edward McDowell's music. And so we put our heads down on the desk, and we listened to at least a half hour, if not an hour's worth of classical music, particularly Edward McDowell, "To a Wild Rose," in an Indian village, and so on. And then I sang in the John Marshall High School glee clubs and sang solos in church. And so singing has been absolutely vital, and it'll probably come up again in our discussion.
And comic books.
Comic books. I was an avid comic book collector. I had about 2,000 comic books by the time I was 10 years old. And I liked Batman, Superman. I had first editions of the Green Hornet and all of those comic books. But then in 1941, at the Fairmount Drugstore, where I bought my comic books, a new comic book appeared. It said True Comics, and it showed Winston Churchill on the front, and the bombs were falling on Big Ben, and Winston Churchill was being quoted that you have nothing to fear. I mean, that we'll fight on everywhere to defend the UK against nothing to offer but blood, sweat, toil, tears. I liked it. I bought it, and then I bought 65 additional copies of True Comics and all the ones similar to them during World War II. That was 41 to 45. I was 15 in 1945, and when the war ended, I was a newspaper carrier, and if they'll show me with the copy, save one copy of an extra that I was selling at 8th and Broad Street. Not that photo. Show us the one with me holding the newspaper. There it is. That's August the 15th, 1945, and I'd saved a copy of that, but I'd sold about 200. They were about 5 cents a piece, and I really kind of feel badly. I was sort of a war profiteer because I made considerable amount of money selling extras in those days. Yeah.
Okay. I understand that in the determination of what your church should be, that girls played a role.
Yes, they did. They were on Fairmount Avenue, which is the main street in the East End where I lived. There were 4 churches, Christian Church, Presbyterian Church across the street from each other, then Fairmount Drugstore in between, then the Baptist Church, and then 1 block down, the Methodist Church. And I had girlfriends that went to all of those, and so I went to the Methodist sometime, and the Baptist, and Presbyterian, and but Mary Lee Watts and I got a little closer than some of the other, and she went to Fairmount Christian, and I remember sitting on the back seat with Mary Lee. We had a young minister who's only about 10 or 12 years older than I, and a Sunday school teacher that really invited us, and there was a class for women, and now you can put the picture of our Sunday school class up, and this is our Sunday school class and the Fairmount Christian Church softball team. The Sunday school teacher is over on the right. His name's George Hobson. George worked for Home Beneficial Insurance Company, but he was an excellent teacher. He just take the Bible verse by verse, apply it to our present lives, He even made sex wholesome. I mean, if you can, it was a wonderful class. You had to attend at least 2 times a month to play on the softball team. And of those 17 people plus the teacher, there are 2 of us left. I talked to the other one the other day who called me to say that one of the others had just died. And so Kay Atkinson and I'm right in the middle. You can barely see me, but I'm right kind of in the middle of everything there. And that picture was taken in 1948, just before I left Richmond to go to college.
Okay, but your time at Fairmount Church really formed the basis for getting you into seminary.
It did indeed, because my preacher and my Sunday school teacher, as well as other folks, they sang in the choir, sang solos. I started giving little talks, Bible talks, and so on, and became kind of the leader of some of the young people. And they said, "Look, we think you have the qualifications for being a minister, pastor." I hadn't thought of it. My high school work was pretty disgraceful so far as college was concerned. I took electricity and mechanical drawing and art and music, and I didn't take languages or higher math or anything like that, and couldn't have gotten into any reputable college. But they said that the college that my minister had graduated from, all that you needed was a high school diploma. They didn't ask any questions beyond that. And so that's how I got into college.
And they also helped you out with the collection plate, I believe.
Took up a collection of $400, bought all my textbooks, and gave me a ride to Cincinnati. So I went to the Cincinnati Bible College and Seminary, it was called.
Okay, so you did your undergraduate work at Cincinnati Bible Seminary,
Right,
starting in 1948.
Yeah, and got my degree in 53.
Right.
Because I got a BA ministerial, it was called.
Right. Okay. How did singing help you get established at the Bible Seminary?
Well, huge luck. My singing has helped me all through my life, and it's been part of the tremendously good luck I've had. We had a new president had just come the same year that I came as a freshman. The new president, Woodrow W. Perry, and Perry wanted to advertise a school, and he wanted a quartet to travel with him to various places to sell Cincinnati Bible College. And they auditioned people to sing, and I became the baritone in the quartet. And every Sunday we would drive to Kentucky or Illinois or Indiana or even to Michigan. We would perform in the morning. He would preach. We would sing. We would go around and visit folks in the afternoon, mainly young people, and then we would sing again at night. And the church, the college didn't have much of an athletic program, and so being a member of the group called the Seminary made me a big man on campus. And that was in September. I got into it, and so everybody kind of looked up to the members of the seminary. So it was a big help.
Right.
Yeah, music. Yep.
Before too long, you met a girl named Miriam.
I did.
And everything changed.
Yeah, she'd become a student at the college the year before, in 1947, and she was a sophomore when I was a freshman, and it happened that we were both in speech class, and I sat behind her, and the main thing I noticed about her was that after class was over and out in the hall of where our classes were, all the guys would gather around her, and I said, well, I don't have a chance with her, but a couple of weeks later, I got up my courage and I called her, and I said, would you go with me to this? And I was amazed. She said yes, and so I learned later she said that the reason that she said yes is that she had just given a ring back to a fellow she was engaged to, because that wasn't working out, and she didn't want anybody to get serious with. So anyway, we did get serious, and by the next summer I had to come back to Richmond, and then I was going to go back, and we wrote letters to each other all 3 months of summer, and we saved those letters. She saved hers, mine to her. I saved hers to me. And if you want to read them, they're in the archives of VCU. But don't look for any real hot romantic communications. We were Bible college students, and there's a lot of piety in those that probably would turn you off pretty quickly. But I worked that summer at Dunn's Barbecue, which used to be at Mechanicsville Pike on Mosby Street and Fairfield Avenue. And I jerked sodas and served sandwiches and so on. And in the evening, men would come in, drink beer, and I'd give them ice cream and so on. And the jukebox was there. And she was off in Wilmington, Ohio, her home, working in a dry cleaning establishment, and she would write me about guys that would come in, and I'd be a little jealous about certain ones that she described that would come in and what they'd say to her, and so the jukebox pieces that they played that summer were Hank Williams' "I Got a Feeling Called the Blues," and Eddie Arnold singing "I'm Throwing Rice at the Girl That I Love," after she just said "I do," and I had to listen to those all summer long and be away. Finally, I went with my mother and my aunt to a jewelry store. I'd saved enough money to buy her an engagement ring, and I hitchhiked 500 miles to her home to take her the engagement ring. And I got there, walked. My last ride was not enough to get to her house, so I had to walk a mile and a half, knocked on the door, and her father came to the door, and he said, "Miriam's not here." And I said, "Well, where is she?" He said, "She's playing the piano in Batavia," which was in the next county. Mm-hmm. And he said, "You can take my truck and go down and see her." So I drove her truck down, and she was practicing her music for the service that night, and I gave her the ring, and she said yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
So then while you were still a student, you became a church pastor as well. How did that work?
Well, in the conservative wing of the Disciples of Christ, at that time, you did not have to be even ordained. You certainly didn't have to have a degree from a seminary. So I was a sophomore in Bible college, and I got a part-time church, 2 part-time churches. The one was in Sugar Creek, Indiana, near Bedford, Indiana, 135 miles from Cincinnati, where Miriam and I had come to live after we married. I didn't say that we got married in 1949. 1949, we got married, and then and that was December. And the next year, I had my first church in southern Indiana, and then I was on the first and third Sundays, and on the second and fourth Sundays, I preached at a little place called Claysville Christian Church in Claysville, Kentucky, near Cynthiana. I don't know if anybody knows any of those places. Cynthiana, not too far from Lexington. Well, anyway, we'd go those, then we'd drive back home. Remember coming back from Indiana in the evening, we'd come through Lawrenceburg, Indiana, and Seagram's was there. And we would get real sleepy, but by the time when we smelled Seagram's, we woke up and made it on into the rest of Cincinnati. But we used to go out to eat with people, and I have some of the most wonderful memories.
This is during your pastorate?
Yeah,
okay.
As a pastor at Sugar Creek, we went to Everett and Sadie's. Everett was a little small, short fellow. His wife was rather large, taller than he. Anyway, we ate dinner with them, and I noticed that Sadie was not eating anything. Everett was doing fine, and I hesitated to do it, but I said, Sadie, aren't you hungry? Don't you want to eat your food? And she said, I'll get to it. And she says, Everett, you've had those teeth long enough. Now give them to me. It took about half of it. Miriam looked at me. I looked at her. I said, oh, my. We didn't know what to say. I mean, what do you say when something like that happens?
Bon appetit.
I mean, one night at Claysville, a lady had 11 children. She gave us a pie to eat. What was it? What kind of pie was it? It was not plum.
Rhubarb.
Rhubarb. It was a rhubarb pie. And so we drove 65 miles back to Cincinnati, and I said, honey, before we go to bed, let's have a piece of the rhubarb pie. And so she cut a slice. I tasted. My mother used to make it. I loved it. She put a lot of sugar in it, but this one didn't have sugar in it. And so I tasted it. I said, honey, this pie is no good. So we threw it in the garbage. And then we drove back to Claysville the following Sunday. Who should come up to the car when we first drove up and said, how did you like my rhubarb pie? And I was about to tell my first pastoral lie. and Miriam leaned over and she said, well, Lenora, I remember her name now, Lenora Kinney. Well, Lenora, she said, a pie like that doesn't last long at our house. Anyway, we're not going to finish this if I keep telling you.
You got to tell us about how you were practicing your phenomenal memory to remember people's names, because I think this is important.
I was at Centerburg, Ohio, giving a series of sermons, and the first night, 2 widows ladies came out, and they looked like the 2 that would be coming back every day. So I said, I'm going to have to remember these people's names. And the one came, and her name was Miss Hoover. And I looked at her and I saw an upright Hoover vacuum cleaner. I said, okay, I think I got that. And the other one, real kind of pale-skinned lady, and I looked at her and I said, Borden's milk. I got it, I think. So the next night, sure enough, the 2 ladies were back, and they come out just smiling. I reached out. There was that upright vacuum cleaner, and I said, hello, Miss Hoover. And she just beamed. And then I looked at the pale-skinned lady, and I said, and Miss Jersey, how are you doing tonight? Well, anyway, I mean, sometimes my mnemonic devices to help my memory fail me. Yep.
Okay. Professor Burke. Professor Burke put you in perhaps in another direction.
I don't think Peter, my son sitting over here, I think he was too young. He's the youngest of our 3 children. My oldest son, Ben, and then my daughter, Michael, who lives in England. We all lived downstairs with the Burks upstairs, and Burks was a philosophy and psychology teacher at the Bible College. And I got attached to Burke because Burke seemed different from these other Bible college teachers. Burke's favorite saying was, all things are more complex than they appear to most people. And somehow that stuck with me, and I looked at my own life and I said, well, that's certainly true. I'm complex. I'm not that simple. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe you folks say, oh, I think you're that simple. But be that as it may, it just hit me that my life and life in general and life in the world was really complex, and I needed to look at it much more critically. And so I became a kind of a disciple of T.G. Burks. Our children only knew him by Burks. I don't know whether Peter remembers Burks or not, but I know Ben and Michael used to just call him Burks. But one thing about Burks is that in 1954, and this is a real crossover point in my life, in 1954, Burks was working on his PhD in philosophy at the University of Cincinnati, and he needed somebody to teach his psychology course. I had his one psychology course, only psychology I ever studied, but he thought I was qualified enough to teach it, and he asked the faculty and the trustees if Bill Blake could teach his psychology class the semester he was out. And I did. And I was one page ahead of all the students, a number of whom had been were in other classes that I had. I remember the name of the beginning textbook, Tiffin, Asher, and Knight. If anybody wants to talk about the James Lotta theory of emotions, I'll be glad to discuss. I remember that distinctly from Tiffin, Asher, and Knight. But I love teaching, and within a few years, they hired me to start teaching church history as an assistant professor in 1958.
Right. So you earned your BA in ministry at the seminary, and while continuing your studies there, you began studying history at the University of Cincinnati.
Yes.
Why?
I started studying history because at the Bible college, I learned some things that I really wondered why some of the other people hadn't hooked onto these things. For instance, I learned that the Bible was not a single book. It was more a library, and it was a library composed of at least 66 writings that people, and first of all, Jewish rabbis putting together the Old Testament or the Jewish scripture, and then the New Testament, writers from all over the place at different times. They'd written things, and there'd been a battle royal in both Old Testament, New Testament about what writings were to go into it. And I said to myself, you can't really understand what's going on here unless you understand the historical and cultural backgrounds. And so I studied history with the hope that I would be able to understand biblical writings more perfectly.
Right. So the seminary then decided to open a graduate school, and they were grooming you to be the chair of the church history department. In order to do that, they wanted you to have a doctor's degree in theology.
Right.
Philosophy. So they sent you to Union Theological Seminary in Richmond to get that.
Right.
But partway through your schooling at Union, you had a falling out with the Cincinnati Bible Seminary. Tell us about that.
In order to be a faculty member at Cincinnati Bible College and Seminary, you had to sign a statement that said that I believe without reservation that the Bible is the infallible and inerrant Word of God. And by the mid-50s even, I had come to begin to question that we had such writings. They knew that I'd begun to have questions about those things, but still they sent me off to Union Theological, Union Presbyterian Seminary, to go back to take over the church history section in 1963, it was hoped. They sent me in 58 to 61 to 60. I left Cincinnati in 61 to study for 3 years, and then I was to go back. But it was in that period that I began to doubt very seriously. In fact, in my own mind, I knew that we didn't have such a biblical work as they required. And so we parted over that. I had hoped that if I went back, I could convince them to drop that and admit that we had scriptures that were pretty human books and not something kind of dropped down out of heaven. And if anybody, I hope not to offend anybody out there. It's a long story, and so if you want to talk about it at length, I'll be happy to talk to you. But in short, it was because I could no longer subscribe to the proposition that our Bible was infallible and inerrant.
Understand. Okay. So you began teaching at Richmond Professional Institute in 1964.
Yeah, I didn't have a job anymore, so I had to get.
And that same year, you became pastor of West Side Christian Church.
Right.
How difficult was it to balance two full-time jobs like that?
Well, it was difficult. It did enable me to establish a style in which people could not tell whether I was preaching or teaching. I mean, because people who heard me teach in the classroom said, "You sound like you're preaching." And people who heard me preach on Sunday morning said, "You're a teacher rather than a preacher, aren't you?" And so it was not that difficult. Even before Westside Christian Church in '64, when I got here in '61, they needed a half-time preacher at the Antioch Christian Church in Bowling Green, and so the minister there had recommendations, and he was leaving, and he had me come and take his place. His name was Jackson Darce. He was a lawyer from Williamsburg, and so I started at Antioch Christian Church, and then in the spring of '62, we had our first community Easter sunrise service there, and it had become the tradition since 1926 that the minister of Antioch Christian Church always gave the Easter sunrise, community Easter sunrise sermon. Catholic priests, Methodist, Baptist, Presbyterian, all the other people were there. They read scripture, prayed, did responsive reading or something. But the Antioch minister gave the Easter sunrise service that morning. Well, I did it for about 5 or 6 years. Then I got the West Side every Sunday, and I couldn't do it anymore. But I had become a tradition, and so they kept having me back to give the sermon. I gave 50 consecutive community Easter sunrise sermons in between 1962 and 2012.
Incredible.
My car always started. I never had a stomach ache. I mean, it's astounding that I was able to do that.
Wow, wonderful. Okay, now we got you to VCU. What courses did you teach, and which were your favorites?
I taught Western civilization. I taught medieval history. My favorite was, and my specialty was, the Renaissance and Reformation, and more particularly Scottish studies. The only thing I ever published was my dissertation, which was about William Maitland of Leamington, who was Mary Queen of Scots' Secretary of State. It was said of him he was the only man in Scotland who could whistle and cluck at the same time and do it with a mouthful of meal. And he was a consummate diplomat. I gave a copy of that to the library here, and I noticed that no one has checked it out since I've been here. Anyway.
That's surprising, isn't it?
Well, I did a little difficulty. Dean Weitzel, Dean of Arts and Sciences at RPI before it became VCU in 1968, he called me in one day and he said, "Mr. Blake, I didn't get my doctorate till '68. I started teaching earlier." He said, "Mr. Blake," he said, you teach, in fact, an article, Alberta Lindsay. Is Alberta here by any chance? Alberta Lindsay was a religion writer for the News Leader, and she interviewed me as a preacher at Westside Christian Church and a teacher at RPI, asking the questions of how you could do both, the very question you just asked. And Dean Marshall said, "Bill, how in the world can you really be a professor here and a preacher there, 2 full-time jobs?" The only thing I could say to him was, "Well, Dean Marshall, what do you do on weekends?" I said, "What do I do on weekends? Yeah, I go to my place on the river. I go sailing. I do this, do that." I said, "Well, you know what I do on weekends? I prepare and preach sermons and lead teach Bible classes and so on." So it's just a question of how you spend your time. Do you think I neglect any of my duties here at VCU? He said, "Well, no, I certainly no evidence of that." I said, "Okay, well, let's keep it. Let's see how we can keep this going. If it becomes a problem, you let me know."
Okay. most of your career you have taught and preached without using notes. Can you tell us when you decided to do that?
It was in the mid-'70s. I would use a manuscript. I'd take a manuscript out. Of course, when you use the manuscript, you look up every now and then. And I noticed when I looked up, there was electricity between me and my students. And I said, yeah, I like that. I like this. I don't like to look at this manuscript. Well, I don't think I even was riveted to it. But anyway, I said, I wonder if I can do this without, I said, I'll start memorizing the main points and take it from there, both in the pulpit and in class. That's what I started doing. It helped me to try to memorize something new every day, which I still try to continue to do. Mainly, I kind of dig up some old things. I mean, I amaze myself, and all of you would amaze yourselves at how much you know, how much you know from memory, and how many you can probably say all the verses of some poem or some song, and you astound yourself at how much you know. Well, so I just every day I go over some poetry, some music, so that I can help keep my memory really strong. And then the big irony is that my sister died at age 60 of MS, which stole her memory, and my wife dies of dementia, which stole her memory. And why God or luck or whatever has kept my memory strong, God only knows.
Tell us about your overseas travels.
Well, by 1970, I'd been teaching Western Civ for several years at RPI VCU. It had just become VCU in '68. And I'd come home and complain to Miriam and to the kids. I complain that I'm describing things out of pictures in textbooks and so on. And these kids now in the summer, they're going to Paris and to Cologne and to UK and so on, and they've seen these things. And Miriam said, as bless her heart, she said, why don't we go? Why don't we go so that you can see these things and describe them as you see them? And so she worked up the whole 8 weeks. So we bought a car. We went to a place here in Richmond, bought a little R16, a Renault French car. We fit our 5 children in it, and we had it delivered in London. And we traveled all over the UK. We went on to the continent. It was an amazing trip. The 5 of us. We even have our passport has all 5 of us in it. Our children were 18, 17, and Peter was 13, I think, at the time. And we traveled all over Europe. We didn't book but 3 hotels. The rest of the time, we'd never camped in our lives, but we stopped at Winchester, England, on the way to the continent and bought a tent and several sleeping bags, got on the ferry to Dover, and that night we pulled out our directions at a campground in France called Bourgochard. How in the world do I remember that? But anyway, the Germans and the French and the Italians, everybody already got in there. They were in their seats. They watched these Americans pull out their tent and their directions and put up their tents. And also our kids were surprised to see these people. I mean, men came out there in their undershorts, and women with almost nothing on in the evenings, and they sat around and watched us put up our tent. Our kids got real good at it. They could put that tent up in 3 minutes, take it down in 3 minutes. Right, Peter? Okay. Yeah, and then that was 1970. We were there we saw 10 countries in 8 weeks. And then I've taught Renaissance history in Perugia one summer, 1973. I took the students to Scotland several times to lecture to them at various places in Scotland. We went, 2 colleagues of mine at VCU, we got Jim Hall here, Tom Hall was in philosophy at VCU. Tom Hall and Bob Talbot in ancient history. The three of us took students over in 1976 to Egypt, Jordan, and Israel. And have you got time for one anecdote from that trip?
Why not?
Not. Time's almost up, isn't it? Okay, skip the anecdote.
Okay.
If somebody asks me, I'll tell them.
All right.
Yeah.
Your favorite story about teaching at VCU?
I'll just give you one. I've got hundreds, but I'll give you one story. In fact, it was probably 2010. I was still teaching adjunct. I retired full-time in '92, but I was teaching adjunct in 2008 or 10, and I was teaching a course called Historical Issues and Ethical Decision Making. And in that course, we were studying Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from the Birmingham jail. And so there were about 25 students, I guess. And so I said, let me read, I want to read you a portion of it. And I started reading, got to a portion about Martin Luther King Jr.'s children asking him, how come we can't go to that amusement park? And the father and Martin Luther tried to explain to his children the reason why they were not admitted to the park. I got in the middle of that, and I got so choked up, and not only got choked up, but I began to sob. And I didn't know what to do. I just sat there and, just sobbed. And there was this little black girl, a black girl in the class. She gets up out of her seat. She comes up. She comes around. She puts her arms around my shoulders. Amazing. I better stop there because I might cry. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm not going to help you out here, Bill. Tell us the impact that Miriam had on your career.
Indispensable. I mean, tremendously disciplined, organizer, list maker, pusher. I wanted to stop or quit at various junctures, and she says, no, you don't. You're going to do this. Kind of person she was. Yeah. Whatever I am, I would not be without her.
Gotcha.
And you can put her picture up there.
All right. There have been several memorials established to honor you and Miriam. Tell us about them.
Well, we love education. We love teaching. Miriam taught first grade and kindergarten, and she'd come home delighted that Johnny learned to read today, and she'd be so happy. So we established scholarships. She got the first VCU degree in 1969 in elementary education. Then she got her master's in 1976 in elementary in reading at School of Education, and then of course I've been in history. Particularly, I taught the history of Christianity at VCU from 1977 to 2012, 35 times. I established that course, and I wanted that course to continue. We wanted that course to continue. So when I retired, she and I gave some money to establish a lectureship in the history of Christianity. We are now on our 28th annual. Martin Marty, Charles Curran, Sam Hill, Jim Smiley, they were some of the lecturers that we've had in the history, that history lecture. And then we gave the scholarships, we had the lectureship. Our hope was that maybe at some point after we died, somebody would establish a chair in the history of Christianity at VCU, maybe a spin-off from the lectureship. And in 2000, I think it was 6, they called me from the office one day and said, we got some good news for you. And I thought maybe somebody had given $1,000 to the lectureship. They said one of your former students, who surprisingly now heads a foundation has given $1 million to establish a chair in the history of Christianity in your and your wife's name.
Wow.
And so we've got we've got scholarships and lectureship and a chair. A fellow by the name of Crislip, Andrew Crislip, Yale, a young Yale scholar who specializes in early Christianity and early Christian medicine. Has got a book called Thorns in the Flesh. You might want to look at it sometime. Incidentally, his wife is named Heather, and since Westminster Canterbury is going to have a transmission of the lecture of the forum. She has recently become the head, the CEO of the forum, the wife of the guy that holds the Blake Chair in the history of Christianity.
How about that?
Yeah,
Great. And I've got one final question for you.
I'll make it short.
When can we look forward to more lectures from you at Westminster Canterbury in the near future?
January the 17th.
Woo!
I'm teaching. I'm starting a 5 lectures on Monday at 3 o'clock, and the title of it is Lessons from Revolutions.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you, Bill.
Hope to see some of you there. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Bill.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Blake. Now, does anyone in our audience have any questions? Jessica will come around with a microphone. I know we covered a lot, but there's got to be some burning questions out there. There we go. Miss Birch. Jessica's coming right to you.
Tell me what they say here.
Yeah.
What was the story that you didn't get to finish?
What was the story you didn't get to finish?
That story was about when we were in Israel. Took students to Israel. The three of us faculty members shared rooms, and it was about midnight when we'd gotten back from the day's travel. And I said, hey, you guys, what I'd like to do by midnight is to walk around the wall in Jerusalem. And they said, oh, we're tired. We got to get up early in the morning. You go on. I said, okay, you guys stay here. I'll go on. So I went on through the Western Gate, went through the Palestinian Quarter, climbed up the stairs, walked along the wall. It was thrilling. It was a perfectly clear night. The moon was out and everything. But you get down to the corner, and you have to go up steps, and you go into a guardhouse that's open, and windows and everything. And I got about 2 steps away from the guardhouse, and I saw the light glinting off 2 rifle butts that were pointed at me. And I started to turn around, and I said, well, you guys got something going. I'll head back the other way. They said, no, you don't. You come in here. So I suddenly had visions of me drooping down the wall with blood streaming out. It's like, anyway, then I saw the light on the sleeves of them, and they were Star of Davids. I said, well, at least they're not, maybe I got a better chance with the Jewish soldiers than Palestinian terrorists. And so they had me come over in the light, and they looked me over, and then they said, okay, you can go on. I lost heart for traveling the rest of the wall after that experience, because I figured there was a guardhouse like this at every quarter, and I didn't want to have to face this a second time. I came on home. That was the story. Yeah.
Any other questions from our audience? All
What's that one?
right. Well, Dr. Blake, you are a true treasure. Thank you so much for sharing this with us today. And I know there will probably be questions that come about, and I know you'll always be willing to answer them or have a cup of coffee with someone to discuss in further detail. So this is wonderful. Thank you.
I'll talk with anybody. Thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate you coming. Really do. You know, my son, Peter, stand up. Let Peter. Peter is the director of the State Council of Higher Education, and among other things. And he and his family are going to New York to see my middle grandson, whose name is Ben, who is in residency at New York Presbyterian Hospital to be a doctor. So they're going to see him.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank
I
you,
really,
everyone.
really appreciate seeing you.